There is a moment that happens between two people when their eyes meet across a crowded room or over a dinner table or in the middle of an ordinary sentence. The world contracts, time slows. In that instant, something passes between them that has no name, no language, no physical form, yet it is as real as breath. It is recognition. It is intimacy. It is the oldest form of conversation humanity has ever known. The eyes do not lie, people say. They are windows, mirrors, doorways into the soul. When you look into someone's eyes, you are seeing past the careful architecture of their words, past the performance of their smile, straight into the raw truth of who they are. Joy flickers there. Fear hides there. Love reveals itself there before it ever finds its way to the lips. To hold someone's gaze is to say, I see you. I am here with you. I am not afraid of what I might find. This is why we teach children to look at us when we speak. This is why lovers search each other's eyes for signs of fading affection. This is why a job interview feels incomplete if the candidate never meets your gaze. Eye contact is the currency of trust, the foundation of connection, the unspoken contract that says we are both present in this moment, vulnerable and visible to one another. But there are those for whom this simple act feels like standing naked in a spotlight. Those who feel the weight of another person's gaze not as warmth, but as pressure, not as connection, but as exposure. Their eyes drift downward, sideways toward the floor, the wall, the space just past your left shoulder. They nod along to the conversation, they smile at appropriate moments, but their gaze never quite lands on yours. And in that absence, the air fills with interpretation. You think they are lying. You think they do not care. You think they are weak, or rude, or hiding something shameful. The downcast gaze becomes evidence of character failure, of deception, of disrespect. You lean forward trying to catch their eye, and they retreat further. The distance between you widens with each failed attempt at connection, and neither of you understands why. What if the averted gaze is not a wall but a shield? What if looking away is not rejection but protection? What if the person sitting across from you, eyes fixed on the table, is not refusing to see you but desperately trying to keep from being swallowed whole by the intensity of being seen? The psychology of those who avoid eye contact is not a story of dishonesty or indifference. It is a story of sensitivity so acute that the ordinary mechanisms of human connection become overwhelming. It is a story of nervous systems calibrated differently, of past wounds that taught dangerous lessons, of minds that process intimacy through channels that do not require the eyes to meet. It is a story that lives in the gap between what we expect from others and what they are capable of giving without breaking. Tonight, we descend into that gap. We will walk through the interior landscape of those who feel safer, unseen, who experience eye contact not as a bridge, but as a border crossing, where too much might be revealed, where the self might be judged and found wanting. We will learn the language of the downcast gaze and discover that what looks like absence is often presence in a different key. We will find that connection does not always require two pairs of eyes to lock together, like puzzle pieces, that some of the deepest seeing happens in the peripheral vision, in the space where we stop demanding proof of attention and start trusting in other forms of truth. The story begins not with those who look away, but with understanding why the gaze itself holds such power, such terror, such unbearable weight. The first myth that must fall is the oldest one. The belief that sits in the back of every courtroom, every interrogation room, every tense conversation where trust hangs in the balance. If someone cannot look you in the eye, they are lying. This is not true. It has never been true. Yet it persists with the stubborn weight of folklore passed down through generations like a genetic inheritance of misunderstanding. Police officers learn it, parents invoke it, employers rely on it. The logic seems sound. A liar avoids eye contact because guilt lives in the eyes, and to meet your gaze would be to confess without words. But the research tells a different story. Studies in psychology and neuroscience have found no reliable correlation between eye contact and honesty. Liars often maintain eye contact deliberately, carefully, because they know this is what you are watching for. They have learned to perform sincerity by holding your gaze a fraction longer than feels natural, by widening their eyes slightly, by giving you exactly what you expect to see. Meanwhile, truthful people look away when they are thinking, when they are remembering, when they are searching for the right words in the crowded filing cabinets of memory. The person who cannot hold your gaze is not necessarily hiding the truth. They are often simply overwhelmed by the act of being perceived. This is not a character flaw. This is not evidence of moral weakness or social incompetence. This is a response of the nervous system, ancient and automatic, operating beneath the level of conscious choice. When their eyes slide away from yours, something deeper than intention is at work. Something primal. Something that understands danger in ways the rational mind has forgotten. Think of the eyes not merely as organs of sight, but as channels of data transmission. When two people make eye contact, they are not just seeing each other. They are downloading vast streams of emotional information, micro-expressions that flicker across the face in fractions of seconds, pupil dilations that signal interest or fear, the subtle tightening around the eyes that betrays anger or pain. All of this floods into the brain simultaneously, demanding to be processed, interpreted, responded to, while you are also trying to speak, to listen, to form coherent thoughts, to manage your own emotional state. For most people, this parallel processing happens automatically. The bandwidth is sufficient, but for some, the channel becomes overloaded. Too much information arrives too quickly. The system cannot handle the simultaneous demands of visual, emotional data and verbal communication. Something has to give, and what gives is the eye contact. They look away not because they do not want to connect with you, but because looking away is the only way they can continue to be present in the conversation at all. By reducing the visual input, by turning down the volume on the emotional data stream, they create space to think, to process your words, to formulate responses that carry meaning rather than static. They are not disconnecting from you. They are recalibrating their connection so it does not short-circuit entirely. This is not avoidance in the way we typically understand it. This is adaptation. This is a nervous system making intelligent choices about resource allocation, choosing depth of listening over the performance of attention. In a world that judges connection by where the eyes land, they have learned to connect through other channels, through the tone of their voice, the leaning forward of their body, the careful selection of words that show they heard every syllable you spoke. But none of this is visible to someone who has been taught that eye contact is the only measure of sincerity, and so the gap widens. The person looking away feels increasingly misunderstood. The person seeking their gaze feels increasingly dismissed. Both are trapped in a mutual misreading, each interpreting the other's behavior through frameworks that do not apply. To understand the averted gaze, we must first stop treating it as evidence of something wrong and start recognizing it as evidence of something different. A different nervous system, a different way of processing intimacy, a different strategy for surviving the overwhelming proximity of another human soul. The reasons someone cannot hold your gaze are as varied as the landscapes of human experience itself. Each averted glance carries its own history, its own logic, its own truth about what it means to be visible in a world that demands constant exposure. Some people are born with nervous systems strung tighter than others. Their neurological wiring processes stimulation differently, more intensely, with less natural filtering between the world and the raw nerve endings of consciousness. For the introvert, the highly sensitive person, the individual somewhere on the autism spectrum, eye contact is not merely uncomfortable, it is physiologically overwhelming. Inside their brain, when eyes meet, the amygdala lights up with activity. This ancient structure buried deep in the limbic system governs fear responses and emotional intensity. For them, direct eye contact triggers the same neural pathways that activate when facing potential threat. Not because the person looking at them is dangerous, but because the sheer volume of emotional information transmitted through the gaze floods the system beyond its capacity to process comfortably. They are not being difficult. They are not choosing to be distant. Their biology is simply asking them to turn down the volume on a world that plays too loud. Looking away becomes a form of self-regulation, a way to remain present without being consumed. In the space where their gaze does not meet yours, they are not disappearing. They are finding the exact distance at which they can still hear you without drowning in the intensity of being fully seen. Then there are those for whom the averted gaze is born not of sensitivity, but of anxiety. Social anxiety turns every human interaction into a performance where the stakes feel catastrophically high. When someone with social anxiety enters a conversation, they carry with them an invisible jury that watches their every move, cataloging failures, anticipating rejection, waiting for proof that they do not belong. To them, your eyes are not windows, but searchlights, scanning for inadequacy, hunting for evidence of their unworthiness. They believe that if they look directly at you, you will see through the careful facade they have constructed and discover the trembling, insufficient person hiding beneath. The eye contact they avoid is not connection they reject, but judgment they fear. Their downcast gaze is not rudeness, but a desperate attempt to control what you can perceive to keep the performance from collapsing under the weight of your scrutiny. There are others still who carry shame like a second skin, not the temporary embarrassment of a small mistake, but the deep corroding shame that whispers they are fundamentally wrong, irreparably broken, unworthy of being fully witnessed. This shame may have been planted in childhood, in moments when love was withheld or criticism was delivered with surgical precision. It may have grown from experiences of rejection, abandonment, or betrayal. It may have calcified over years of feeling unseen in all the ways that matter and overseen in all the ways that hurt. For them, your gaze is not neutral. It is inherently evaluative. They look away not because of anything happening in the present moment, but because they carry a lifetime of internal verdicts that have already found them guilty. To meet your eyes would be to invite you into the courtroom where they have condemned themselves and they cannot bear to see their own judgment reflected back from your face. The floor, the wall, the middle distance, these become refuges from a visibility that feels like exposure without protection. And then there are those whose avoidance was learned in contexts where being seen was genuinely dangerous. Children who grew up under the gaze of volatile adults, where eye contact was interpreted as defiance, where looking directly at an angry parent meant inviting escalation. Survivors of abuse who learned that the eyes of others held not affection but surveillance control violation. People from environments where trust was a luxury they could not afford, where every interaction required calculation, where vulnerability was punished rather than met with care. Their nervous systems learned a lesson. Written in survival, being fully visible means being fully vulnerable, and vulnerability leads to pain. Even years later, even in contexts of safety, the body remembers. The instinct to look away is not a conscious choice, but an ancient reflex, a protection mechanism that once kept them safe and now keeps them isolated. They are not avoiding you. They are avoiding the memory of everyone who looked at them the way you are looking at them now before something terrible happened. There is also the quiet influence of culture, often overlooked in Western contexts, where direct eye contact is coded as confidence and respect. In many Asian, indigenous, and African cultures, prolonged eye contact with elders or authority figures signals disrespect or challenge. Children are taught from their earliest years to lower their gaze as an act of humility and deference. What looks like anxiety or evasion may simply be the embodiment of values learned at a grandmother's knee, carried across oceans and generations, misread as personal failing in a culture that demands different forms of proof. Each of these roots runs deep. Each tells a story about what the body has learned, what the mind believes, what experience has taught about the cost of being fully seen. The averted gaze is not one thing, but many things, each requiring its own form of understanding, its own measure of patience. But what if we have been reading the map upside down? What if the averted gaze is not the absence of connection, but the presence of a different kind of attention, one that operates through channels we have failed to recognize because we are so fixated on what the eyes are doing? There is a paradox buried in the act of looking away. When someone breaks eye contact to speak with you, they may actually be listening more carefully than the person who stares directly into your eyes without pause. This sounds counterintuitive. We have been trained to believe that attention lives in the gaze, that to look away is to disconnect. But attention is not a single spotlight. It is a resource that can be allocated in multiple directions, and sometimes directing it away from the visual allows it to flow more fully into the auditory, the emotional, the semantic. When they look at the table at the window at some point in the middle distance while you are speaking, they are not tuning you out. They are tuning everything else down so they can hear you more clearly. The visual information streaming from your face, the micro-expressions, the subtle shifts in posture, the play of light across your features, all of this takes processing power. For some minds, that processing power is needed elsewhere, in parsing the meaning of your words, in tracking the emotional undertones of your voice, in holding space for the complexity of what you are trying to communicate. They are not ignoring your presence. They are honoring your message by removing the distraction of visual noise. In a world obsessed with performance and appearance, they have found a way to prioritize substance over optics. Their attention does not live where you expect to find it, but it is there nonetheless, perhaps more fully present than you realize. Watch them closely, not with your eyes, but with your awareness. Notice how their body orients toward you even as their gaze drifts away. Notice the tilt of their head angled to catch every word. Notice how they respond with precision to things you said minutes ago, remembering details that even you had forgotten. This is not the behavior of someone who is disengaged. This is the behavior of someone who has learned to listen with their whole nervous system rather than just their eyes. There is another truth hidden in the downcast gaze, one that speaks to a different kind of integrity. Sometimes they look away because they are feeling something too intensely to perform neutrality. A wave of grief rises unexpectedly during casual conversation. Anger flares at an offhand comment. Tears gather behind their eyes and threaten to spill. In that moment, to meet your gaze would be to surrender control, to let you see the raw emotion before they have had time to understand it themselves, before they have decided whether they want to share it or keep it private. The averted gaze becomes a boundary, a temporary shield that allows them to remain in the conversation without having to perform emotional availability beyond their capacity in that moment. They are not hiding from you. They are protecting something fragile inside themselves, something that needs a moment to find its shape before it can be offered up for witness. This is not dishonesty. This is actually a form of profound honesty, the refusal to fake an emotion they do not feel, the unwillingness to manufacture a facial expression that does not match their interior state. In a culture that demands constant emotional labor, constant performance of engagement and enthusiasm, their downcast gaze is a small act of resistance. It says, "I am here, but I will not pretend to be more available than I actually am. I will not smile at you with my eyes, while rage or sorrow or overwhelm churns beneath the surface." There is dignity in this. There is respect both for themselves and for you in the refusal to falsify connection. They would rather be authentically awkward than performatively present. They would rather risk your judgment of their averted gaze than betray their own emotional truth by manufacturing eye contact that carries no genuine warmth behind it. So perhaps the question is not why they cannot look at you, but why we have decided that looking is the only valid form of seeing, that eye contact is the only acceptable proof of presence. Perhaps the work is not to fix them, but to expand our definition of connection, to learn to read attention in its many forms, to trust that intimacy can travel through pathways other than the direct meeting of eyes. Perhaps the real growth happens when we stop demanding that everyone connect in the same way and start learning to recognize connection in whatever language it speaks. There is no cure for the averted gaze, because there is nothing to cure. But there are ways to make the space between two people less fraught, less filled with misunderstanding, less heavy with the weight of expectations that neither person can meet. There are ways to build bridges that do not require everyone to cross in exactly the same manner. For those who carry the downcast gaze like a birthmark, like something they were born into and cannot simply decide to abandon, there is first the work of releasing the shame, the internal voice that says you are doing connection wrong, that you are failing some fundamental test of human normalcy. That voice is not telling you the truth. It is telling you what the world has taught you to believe about yourself, which is different from what is actually true. You do not owe anyone constant eye contact. The unspoken social contract that demands you maintain visual connection for some predetermined percentage of every interaction was written without consulting you, without accounting for your particular nervous system, without considering that there might be other equally valid ways to show up in relationship. The standard is not a law of nature. It is a cultural preference, and preferences can be negotiated. Begin with permission. Give yourself permission to look away when you need to. When the intensity becomes too much, when your brain needs a moment to process, without the additional load of managing facial expressions and reading micro-expressions simultaneously. This is not weakness. This is self-knowledge. This is working with your wiring rather than against it. But there is also space for small experiments, gentle stretches of capacity that do not demand you become someone else entirely. You do not need to stare unblinking into someone's eyes for the duration of a conversation. Even those who are comfortable with eye contact typically maintain it only half the time, while speaking perhaps slightly more while listening. The standard you imagine you are failing to meet does not actually exist. Connection happens in glances, in brief meetings of eyes that punctuate longer periods of looking elsewhere. Try this when you begin speaking. Let your gaze rest briefly on the other person's face. Just a moment, just long enough to acknowledge that you see them, that you are present. Then let your eyes drift naturally to wherever they want to go while you find your words. Return again at the end of your thought, another brief landing before you release back into listening. These small touches of visual contact, like a hand briefly squeezing another hand before letting go, carry their own weight of connection. They are enough. If direct eye contact remains too intense, there are places nearby that offer relief without complete disconnection. The bridge of the nose, the space between the eyebrows, the general area of the face rather than the specific target of the pupils. To the other person, this often reads as eye contact, even though, for you, the intensity is significantly reduced. It is a kind of compromise, a way of meeting in the middle that honors both your need for regulation and their need for acknowledgement. And with those who know you, who have earned your trust through patience and time, there is the option of simply naming it, not as an apology, not as a confession of inadequacy, but as information. I sometimes need to look away to think clearly, but I'm listening. Eye contact can be overwhelming for me, so if I'm looking elsewhere, know that I'm still here with you. This kind of transparency removes the guessing, the interpretation, the story the other person might otherwise construct about your avoidance. It replaces mystery with clarity, and clarity is its own form of intimacy. For those on the other side, those who find themselves in conversation with someone whose gaze will not land on theirs, the work is different but equally important. It begins with a conscious decision to pause the automatic interpretation, to interrupt the story your mind wants to tell about what their averted eyes mean. Your discomfort with their lack of eye contact is real, but it is not the same as accurate understanding. The gap between what you feel and what is actually happening in the other person's interior world may be vast. Create the conditions for easier connection by changing the geometry of your interaction. Sitting face to face across a table creates a confrontational energy, a sense of being on opposite sides. Walking side by side or sitting at an angle removes the pressure of constant mutual visibility. Some of the most honest conversations happen in cars, in the dark, in contexts where people can speak without being watched. This is not avoidance but invitation, a way of saying, you do not need to perform connection for me. Your presence is enough. Listen to them the way they are listening to you, with attention that is not conditional on eye contact. Trust that their body language, their tone, their words are all carrying information about their engagement. Learn to read presence in forms other than the meeting of eyes. Connection is not a single gesture repeated over and over. It is a vocabulary of many words, and fluency requires learning more than one way to say, I see you. I am here. This matters to me. In the end, this is a story about the inadequacy of a single map to describe the infinite territories of human connection. We have been taught that there is a right way to be present with another person, a correct sequence of gestures and glances that signals openness, trustworthiness, engagement. We have been taught that eyes must meet for meaning to pass between two souls. But the world is wider than this teaching. Connection speaks in 1,000 dialects, and only some of them require the gaze to hold steady. Some people build bridges through sustained eye contact, through the willingness to be seen and to see in return without flinching. Others build bridges through words chosen with precision, through the quality of their listening, through the way they remember small details from conversations held weeks ago. Still others connect through shared silence, through the willingness to simply occupy space together, without demand, without performance, without the exhausting labor of constant mutual visibility. None of these is more valid than the others. None of these is the single true path to intimacy. The maturity of relationship lies not in demanding that everyone connect in the way that feels most natural to you, but in learning to recognize and honor the ways that feel most natural to them. It requires a kind of bilingualism, a willingness to learn the grammar of another person's emotional language, even when it differs from your own. It requires the humility to admit that your comfort is not the standard by which all human interaction should be measured. When you encounter someone whose eyes drift away from yours, whose gaze finds refuge in the floor or the wall, or some point beyond your shoulder, you are standing at a threshold. You can interpret this as rejection, as disrespect, as evidence of something wrong with them or with the moment you are sharing, or you can choose a different story. You can choose curiosity over judgment, patience over demand. You can ask yourself, what might it be like to live in a body that processes intimacy differently than mine? What might it cost them to meet my expectations, and is that cost one I have the right to demand? Think of them as a book with a plain cover, unremarkable from the outside, easy to overlook on a crowded shelf. If you judge only by the exterior, if you demand that the cover be decorated in the specific way you have learned to associate with quality, you will walk past without ever knowing what chapters wait inside. But if you are willing to pick up the book, to open it despite its unassuming appearance, you may find stories of remarkable depth insights that reshape your understanding truths that could only have been written by someone who has spent long hours in territories of experience you have never visited. The person with the averted gaze is not broken. They are not failing at some essential human task. They are simply navigating the world with a different set of tools, a different calibration of sensitivity, a different definition of what it means to be safely visible. To see them clearly requires looking past the surface behavior to the complex human being beneath it, the one who is trying in their own way, with their own limitations and gifts, to build connection in a world that does not always understand the language they speak. So the next time you find yourself in conversation with someone whose eyes will not meet yours, try something different. Instead of leaning forward, trying to capture their gaze, trying to make them prove their presence in the way you expect, try leaning back. Try creating space. Try letting your own need for eye contact soften just enough that they can breathe. Send them not a demand, but an offering, the quiet message that they are safe with you exactly as they are, that your acceptance is not conditional on their ability to perform connection according to a script they did not write. Because the deepest form of seeing has nothing to do with where the eyes land. It happens when two people recognize each other's humanity across whatever distance, whatever difference, whatever difficulty exists between them. It happens in the space where judgment dissolves and compassion rises to take its place. It happens when we stop demanding proof and start trusting presence, when we learn that some of the richest conversations occur in the gaps, in the silences, in the downcast glances, where whole invisible worlds are waiting, patient and undefended to be finally gently heard.